Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's our pleasure to have you here with us as we celebrate 4 years of the Rights for Time research project. We're a Network Plus that's been funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. We're an interdisciplinary collaborative of academics, NGOs, civil society organizations, charities, many other organizations that are in communities all around the world who are taking a critical look at humanitarian protection, analyzing what is meant by trauma, what is meant by crisis, and how can we enable policymakers to better respond to crises in the way that we define it as Rights for Time. What I'd like to do is to introduce the other investigators that are involved in this project with me. So if I could please hand it over to Zoe.
Crisis in art.
Hello, my name is Zoe Norwich. I'm a co-investigator on Rights for Time and I specialize in cultural responses to genocide in Rwanda.
Thanks, Zoe. And Kirsten.
Hi everyone, I'm Kirsten. I'm a research fellow with the Rights for Time Research Network, and I have predominantly worked on the Kenya case study looking at sexual violence survivors.
Thank you. Tammy.
Wonderful to be here. So my name is Tamira Sahouri, and I'm the lead co-investigator for the case of Policy Time on Lebanon at Rights for Time. And I've been working a lot on refugee and migration governance, as well as post-war political processes in the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you. Ben.
Hi everyone. Yeah, my name is Ben Warwick, and my interests are around human rights and in particular how they affect socioeconomic conditions and how law gets involved in regulating around socioeconomic conditions.
Thank you. Nora.
Hi, my name is Nora Parr. I am the lead on the Palestine case study along with Rasha Bayoumi. My interests are in Arabic literature and questions of trauma and its representation.
Thank you. Rasha.
I'm Associate Professor of Psychology at the University of Birmingham and co-I on the project. I work closely with Nora on the Palestine case and mentoring for the Pakistan case, and my research interest is in trauma and women's health. Thank you.
Thank you. Anela.
Hi everyone, I'm Anela Williams and I'm the Project Officer for the Rights for Time Network. Over to you, Heather.
On behalf of the investigative team, we really want to thank Anela for pulling this day together and making it possible. A lot of this is based on her inspiration and her creativity, and we're really, really proud of what you've drawn together. So thank you so much, Anela. We also have Jenny Leonard with us, who is going to be visualizing today by drawing animations. So you could take a look at what she's doing on her screen throughout our time today. Well, without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Nora Parr, who is going to tell us a bit more about the project.
Mute and full screen. I think we'd all be really good at this. There we go. No, sorry. Okay, I'm going to leave it like this because I also need to have my notes handy. So welcome everyone. Rights for Time is such a gigantic network project that we wanted to begin today by breaking down some of the themes that we have found that really will cross-cut all of the things that you hear over the next couple of days for those of us who are able to join us for multiple sessions. This is a result of some interviews and discussions and network analysis. And what we see across really all of our projects is that everybody is involved in breaking and making. We see repeatedly across work on mental health, across work with minority communities, across work with sexual assault survivors, with unspeakable minorities, with all of the different communities that we've looked at. Our project partners are spending a lot of time breaking down existing systems. And so one of our big kind of recommendations is that the sort of the prevalence of existing structures of representation and of let me see if I can pull up some of our examples. So we have from the Palestine Trauma Center, for example, that works around mental health, and they spend a great deal of time breaking down stigmas and breaking down existing systems. They spent 15 years trying to sort of reinvent existing protocols for working on mental health. And if it were just a little bit easier to break down some of the barriers to making something new, their work would be a lot sort of the innovations that they know to be true would be a lot easier to kind of make visible and hearable within the sort of larger fields of the disciplines, the area studies, and of course our academic frameworks, and then also around policy. So they don't so much suggest alternatives, but rather our projects break down the existing system and make something new. So rather than spending their time trying to fix a broken system, they tend to break the system and make a new one. And we're going to see from the case studies and from the project presentations over the next couple of days how that works with each of the projects. Another really interesting finding that we had from across all of our work was around the theme of safe evidence, and looking at how all of our different projects collected evidence and worked with communities in ways that kind of the ethical frameworks can't really capture. We have here, for example, work with Azadi Kenya, who worked around human trafficking survivors and the harm that they endured, trying to make their stories the primary stories, working with individuals to be able to navigate and negotiate large kind of media environments, and then also kind of carving out space for people to learn how to tell their own stories in and on their own terms, and using a really wonderfully integrated kind of arts component where artistic expression and finding ways outside of a kind of linear narrative was a really important way to foster, nurture, and mentor kind of critical reflective spaces for survivors to be able to feel empowered to tell their own stories, represent themselves more powerfully on a local and a global stage, and also be able to speak their experience to policymakers, so that policy might actually reflect the experience, so that protection might actually be able to respond to the real needs of individuals. That really cuts across kind of the right, when we're talking in the context of human trafficking, right, beyond this kind of moment of trafficking to the much larger experience of the individual. And they were collecting evidence of human trafficking by sort of people who had been trafficked, but also by empowering them to be able to tell their own story. And so it is not an extractive evidence process, but rather something that builds things for a much larger and longer term future. We also have, for example, the Tamer Institute in the West Bank, based in Ramallah, with offices also in Gaza. And they were working on collecting evidence safely from children who had been imprisoned in their homes in East Jerusalem. The process of getting evidence from these kids who are too afraid to speak, by and large, and I wonder, I have somewhere here the book that Tamer has recently published, which is a sort of genre-defining, here it is, Beneath the Hunter's Rifle. They've done an absolutely beautiful job of recording the experience of these kids in ways that don't put them at increased risk, but does communicate the story. So the author herself of the work has collected testimonies and has artworks for the kids, and has made a real fascinating compilation of work to try and get across the experience and the larger meaning of the experience for these kids. And again, we're going to see from so many of our case studies the ways that they have collected evidence in ways that keep the community safe, that make the community feel even more safe, that they're being responded to, and that they're creating, they have created, and we by extension, have been able to collect an evidence base that is not extractive, but that in fact gives back to the communities and gives resources for understanding the different conditions that they live within. Our third cross-cutting theme is around times of trauma. A lot of the vulnerable communities that our projects have worked with have experienced trauma well beyond the sort of typical notion of a one singular terrible event that must be worked through and gone past. The diverse members of our network have been exploring themes of intergenerational trauma and its impact on cultural memory. We have work in conflict and post-conflict settings, and just an overwhelming body of evidence to show that when we're talking about locations in need of humanitarian protection, the question of trauma is not a time-limited one, and it is not limited to the individual. It is something that affects an entire community, and in addressing it, we need to address not just the individual and a particular harm, but to kind of zoom way out and think about the times of trauma in sort of diverse and complex ways. That really just means kind of dissolving the conceptual boundaries of, it's not just a traumatic event, but there are systems and structures that go into making it. And these are what needs to be addressed rather than one sort of slice of time and one singular moment. Okay, I'll move on to our last one, which is finances and trust, which is something that is part of the legacy of our project. And when our project came in, as a government-funded research network, we unfortunately were at the whims of much larger systems ourselves. We had funding paused, funding taken away, funding given back in, and that created a lot of uncertainty, not only for us as co-leaders of this network, but primarily for our partners, not knowing whether or not they could plan. And of course, this was all in the larger context of COVID and shifting government spending priorities. But we had all sorts of partners in the Global South who didn't know whether or not their projects were going to go forward. This created just huge disruptions, and we've collected just boatloads of evidence, further evidence on why sort of these we need longer term projects, we need consistency, we need to do relationship building, and just how harmful it is on so many levels when large funding bodies make decisions like this. I mean, we've had examples of individuals relying on extended family networks to support the work that Rights for Time commissioned. And just by putting our partners in a position of risk when we are meant to be understanding larger contexts of harm, and the work that we need to do to create solid and stable relationships with our partners to sort of get past issues around sort of funder inconsistencies. I mean, it just really reinforces how important it is to create stable, long-term relationships of trust with partners, so that work can go ahead and so that lines of communication can be clear. And there were massive implications around sort of hierarchy and who can say when there's a problem. And Rights for Time has just done a really phenomenal job of trying to sort of cut through some of those hierarchies and make open platforms so that partners can readily air grievances or issues that they're facing around kind of dealing with sort of a university network that is also working in the humanitarian sector. So the issue of finances and trust, I think it will come as no surprise that stable finances help create trust, but the impact of this on sort of sustainable relationships was really a huge theme for us, just given how rocky it had been. But I think it's a testament to the project that we have sustained 12 projects in 12 countries, 5 case studies. Partners have continued with us over the duration of our many years. Yeah, we're really, really pleased to be able to bring everybody together today.
Thank you so much, Nora. I'd like to acknowledge that we've got Rana Dejani, who is another investigator on the project, and she is the deputy PI for Rights for Time. She is in the participant section rather than the speaker panel, so unfortunately she won't be able to introduce herself, but I did want to acknowledge that she's here. Hi, Rana. Thank you for joining us. Okay, and so next we have Dr. Kirsten Wagner, who is going to tell us a bit more about our network project. Over to you.
Hi again, everyone. As a research fellow, I've been working on synthesizing the network's findings around temporality over the last year to highlight how and what Rights for Time contributes to the discourse on humanitarian protection. As it turns out, bringing together what 15 research projects have learned and achieved over 4 years is not an easy task. So to help me understand what the network has gained in terms of insights, we implemented a network analysis that facilitated the identification of key themes across our projects. The ambition behind this analysis was, first of all, to summarize and synthesize the findings, but also to work towards our legacy and eventually create a charter that offers guidance on integrating temporal perspectives into protection policy and practice, and encourages organizations to commit to temporal awareness by signing on to the charter and holding themselves accountable. For now, I hope that the themes I've identified can provide some foundational knowledge for the presentations you'll see over the next few days and offer a kind of lens through which to view them and reflect on their potential impact. For a bit of background, as Heather and Nora have explained, the network addresses the challenge that the long-term impacts of trauma and harm are not well understood, and that humanitarian protection has traditionally focused on short-term needs, often neglecting the more complex long-term effects of conflict on individuals and communities. Our projects have been working to increase awareness of the need to emphasize temporal dimensions to protection efforts in order to shift the focus from immediate needs to the more long-term impacts of conflict. And the network has been doing that by building an evidence base that shows why responding more enduringly to crisis is so important. As we've heard, the network consists of 15 projects, each using time as a key analytic to study crisis and protection. And you will hear presentations from each of them over the next 4 days, covering topics like intergenerational trauma, Indigenous heritage, long-term displacement, and mental health needs, as well as policy cycles and other subjects where temporal dimensions of harm are concerned. The network analysis was designed to show how temporality is leveraged across these projects, highlighting synergies, differences, and knowledge clusters within the network. And the data collection for that consisted of 2 parts. We've designed mixed method surveys that were filled in by each member of the network, Likert scales, multiple choice, and open-ended questions on time, harm, and protection. And then as a second part, we've conducted semi-structured interviews with the project leads of our 10 commissioned projects at the beginning and end of their funding period, to gain insights on how they address temporal dimensions. A qualitative thematic content analysis of the provided answers showed, first of all, the temporal perspectives were indeed integral to the projects, thank God. And the 8 themes listed on the slide here reflect the most prominent synergies in areas where temporal perspectives were considered important. We won't have time to go into each of them with a detailed analysis, but I'll say a little bit about each of the various themes so we can revisit them over the course of the next days as we talk about the different projects. First of all, the network analysis highlighted that many projects considered time crucial for healing from conflict as well as personal growth. Time was believed to act as a transformative agent, allowing people to reflect and shift their identities during or after conflict. It was noted that healing isn't a straight line, but a process that comes in waves with progress and setbacks. And time was also considered important in empowering individuals to take control of their stories. For example, our projects in Kenya that work with survivors of sexual violence found that over time, individuals begin seeing their traumatic experience as a source of resilience, showing how transformative time can be in interpreting experiences. Then as a second temporal theme, projects emphasize the role of time in building community resilience and collective experiences. They discussed that shared experiences over time strengthen community bonds and that historical resilience practices prepare communities for future conflict and crisis. Intergenerational stories, for instance, were considered to pass down survival strategies and reinforce cultural identity, while the collective memory of conflict was said to contain information about how to behave and act during current or future crises. Theme 3 revealed how different cultures perceive time and how this impacts their response to crisis. Projects noted that in some cultures, views of nonlinear and cyclical concepts of time were linked to resilience and recovery. They also found that during crisis, people's sense of time can change or alter. A lesson to take away from that may be that tailoring humanitarian efforts to local time concepts could make interventions more effective by making them more culturally sensitive. We also learned that understanding historical trauma and conflict memory is crucial in shaping how communities respond to crisis. Two projects working with communities with prolonged historical trauma found that these communities had unique resilience strategies rooted in their collective memory. This shows how important historical awareness is in humanitarian efforts and would suggest that policies that take the historical context into account could lead to more effective recovery strategies. Then theme number 5 is further centered on how time perception gets distorted during crisis. One project highlighted how people in conflict zones experience time either as dragging on or speeding up, which really affected their mental health and daily routines. And they concluded that recognizing these distortions may be key to providing aid in times of conflict. Theme 6 shows that time is a tool for empowering communities and advocating for change. A project involving community storytelling found that documenting and archiving stories not only empowers individuals, but also challenges short-term crisis responses, since engaging communities in reflective practices may help anticipate their needs and advocate for them to be met, making interventions more sustainable and locally driven. Then theme 7, we're almost there, adds reflections on how art captures the experiences of time in conflict zones in a unique way, a topic that we will hear more about later. And projects discuss that creative practices can help individuals and communities navigate their relationships with conflict, like heal from past traumas or envision hope and future possibilities, concluding that art indeed is a powerful medium for reflecting and processing crises. Then finally, the last theme shows the importance of time related to aspects of education. Projects emphasize that long-term educational strategies were key for fostering peace and building a community resilience, especially those that consider the evolving needs of communities over time. One project focusing on long-term educational programs found that adapting the programs to align with the community's rhythm contributed to that community's resilience. Right, so what do we do with that? I'll keep this brief since policy recommendations and legacy are going to be the focus of the 4th day of the summit. But overall, the network analysis found a clear consensus among the projects that considering time and addressing conflict and crisis is crucial, including the necessity for long-term funding to sustain longer-term oriented initiatives. And like I said earlier, our goal ultimately is to use these findings to advocate for a global commitment to temporally informed strategies. And we are hoping to turn these themes and other learnings into a set of principles that acts as a call to action, inviting organizations, policymakers, and practitioners to adopt a more temporally aware approach to humanitarian protection, and recognizing where temporal misalignment could hinder efforts, while alignment could improve them. I'll leave it here. We'll now take a very short break, I believe, so feel free to grab a cup of coffee, and then we'll start our case study presentations, where you'll likely recognize some of the overarching themes I've just talked about. Heather, should we meet back here in a few minutes? Thanks, everyone.
Yes, that sounds great. I'll see everybody back here at 13:10 BST.
Perfect.
6 minutes. Thank you. Now to introduce Dr. Zoe Norwich, who's going to tell us about the case study we've been conducting in Rwanda. Over to you.
Thank you. I'm just going to share. Thank you very much for that. I'm just going to share my screen. Can you see the slides?
Before we continue, just asking everyone to mute their screens, please. Thank you. Over to you, Zoe.
Thank you so much, Nella. So my name is Zoe Norwich, as I said earlier, and I led on the Rwanda case study alongside my colleague Jacques Nizingabo, who is the director of the Kigali Center for Photography, which was a grant partner, Richard Nakirutimana, who is the director of AIMPO, also a grant partner, and Renee Kitelekamboya, who is a writer, an artist, a curator, and here she was a project manager and curator for the project. And Renee is also with us today, so I'm hoping, Renee, that if you disagree with anything or if you want to add anything as I present, that you'll feel free to jump in, please. I don't know if there's going to be questions at the end, Anela, but if there is, also it'd be lovely to hear from you then, Renee. Okay, so I wanted to give you a little bit of a background to the work that we were doing in Rwanda. We were working with a group of historically marginalized people who were formerly known as the Batwa, one of the three main ethnicities in Rwanda. And this particular group have experienced lots of forms of dehumanization. So they were dehumanized in pre-colonial times, Taylor argues, and they were also dehumanized consistently across the region during colonial times with lots of colonial stereotypes. The Batwa in colonial times were known as pygmy, and they kind of with a lot of negative things that came with that. They have also suffered from being displaced from their traditional lands through a mixture of deforestation, as the forests have been sort of pushed and shrunk, and conservation efforts as well. So protecting the gorillas and other wildlife has resulted in them being moved out of particular sort of areas. And they've suffered from the after effects of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. That's a genocide against the Tutsi during which over 1 million people were died, over 1 million Tutsis were killed in Rwanda as a form of the genocide, but also other people died too, including the Tutsi, and estimates are that 30% of them lost their lives during that period. So the remaining 25 to 30,000 historically marginalized people now in Rwanda constitute one of the poorest and most vulnerable communities in the country. Progress has been made with policy, and in fact, the people we were working with were very strong on saying how much the government has changed, is trying to change attitudes and has introduced policies that are changing situations for them. But widespread discrimination remains and runs very deep within Rwandan society. It's also quite delicate to explore this discrimination because of the political sensitivities. Part of that is that it's difficult to talk about ethnicity after the genocide because that can be seen as inciting genocide ideology. So you always have to be quite careful to contextualize, as I've been trying to do today. But again, if you have any Rwandans with us on this, I'd love to hear from you about that. So in terms of conception, this came about because Richard Nakirutimana, the director of AIMPO, was giving a talk at a conference at King's with SOAS and the Aegis Trust. And he was talking about the difficulties that are still being faced by Batwa, historically marginalized people. And one of the things he said was that there weren't very many opportunities for them to self-represent. They were always being represented by others. At that point, I hadn't done any work with this particular community at all, but I had done a lot of work with genocide survivors around the importance of Rwandan survivor voices in talking about the genocide and giving testimony and so on. And so I went up to Richard afterwards and said, I know lots of people in Rwanda who could help you to change this situation. And that's how we began talking about photography and how we could collaborate with photographers to enable Batwa communities to self-represent through photography. So we then went to Rwanda in November 2019 to do a needs identification exercise. And that's what the photograph is there, where we sat down with young people in a particular village, Nyabageni, which is on the border with Congo. And we sat down and talked to them about the kinds of stories they wanted to tell people outside their community about themselves. And this informed the overall network grant application that we went on to make. And Richard was also a key part of that grant application. As Nora said, then there were delays due to COVID and GCRF. And because of those delays, the partners had other priorities and it was hard to get things going again. So we appointed the wonderful Kenyan filmmaker, Renee Kitelekamboya, to project manage delivery in May 2022 and to curate the resulting exhibition coming out of this. So we then ran a workshop for 5 days in June 2022 with 12 Batwa artists, 6 men, 6 women. We spent our mornings at the Northern Creative Corner Gallery in Musanze and our afternoons and one Sunday in between some of the days in Nyabageni developing photo essays. Our aims for the Rwanda case study overall were to use photography to surface and to challenge long-standing discrimination, to build equitable community-led relationships, and to build capacity through multi-directional exchange. Now, in the workshop in particular, we wanted to offer participants the opportunity to engage creatively with past and present discrimination, so to rethink it, to symbolize it, to play with it, if you like. We wanted them to challenge and renegotiate the ways in which historically marginalized people have been written out of history, and we hope that they would articulate diverging hopes and dreams for the future. So here are a few images I just wanted to share with you of that workshop in process. At the top left, that's the Northern Creative Corner Gallery. There's some indoor spaces where we met, but there's also this huge garden where we used natural light to do exercises with cameras, where we would eat outside as well, where we would spend time with each other talking and so on. And it became a space. It was a space that was unfamiliar to people who were participating in the beginning, but it became a space that they were very comfortable in and sort of took ownership of over the week. And that was a joy to see them sort of enjoying being in the city a lot more. On the bottom there, you have an image of the gallery again, but this time with the exhibition installed by Renee. And you have members who participated in the workshop, but you also have people from the community and then people from the city who've come to engage with the work, to engage with these stories. On the top right-hand side, you have Renee on the left-hand side there, Jacques in the front, arriving in the community to support photographers as they were doing their photo storying. And in the bottom right-hand side there, you have Jacqueline, who is doing a consent form process with some of the people that she was photographing, which makes me smile because of, just to take all these forms out there, it was an interesting and strange activity. And I think there might have been better ways to do it. But there you go. These were the university regulations. So these images are actually my images. I took them just as a bit of a visual diary, and I'm glad I did because it's useful to be able to show them with you. But what I want to focus on today are the images that were taken by these 12 artists from Nyabageni. And I'm going to present them to you in terms of the work, the kind of the symbolic work that I think they're doing. This has also been written up in a journal article with Renee Akitilek-Mboya that's forthcoming in the Journal of African Cultural Studies. The last thing remaining on that is to finalize the Kinyarwanda translation of the abstract, which is, it turns out, is the hardest thing to do. So in that article, we present the work in two groupings. The first grouping is called From the Forest to the Farm, Engaging with Change Through Layering the Past and Present. Okay, so that section begins with this image by Kazungu Pascal of an old man standing in the main street in Nyabageni, the main road in Nyabageni, and it's taken by Kazungu Pascal. Now, there's a contrast here between the identity of Kazungu, who is actually one of the more upwardly mobile of the photographers. He's somebody who makes his living carrying fertilizer for other farmers. So he engages with people of all different ethnicities. He's quite geographically mobile, very articulate, and so on. So the contrast between him and the old people that he loves to photograph. These old people are smoking, are people who've kind of refused to give up smoking. Smoking's not very socially acceptable in Rwanda these days. But these old people are hanging on to it as something they used to do in the forest, and as part of that old way of life that they want to carry on bringing through with them into new life in the village. And so he explains that his images show both past and present. They help us to move through time. So he and the other photographers thought hard about how to show the relationship between the forest of the past and the villages of the future. And he does this through juxtaposing the old with the young as well. And here you see the older man in the foreground, and then in the background you have the younger people sort of playing a game there. And he also does it through juxtaposing older people with more modern buildings. The buildings you see on either side of this woman are the buildings built by the government as part of their efforts to bring this community out of poverty. Yet behind this woman, you see the forest and the mountains, the volcanoes stretching behind her. So there's a contrast between what is in the past and what is in the present. Now, Chastula Mokapeferefe adopted quite a different strategy. She wanted to navigate past and present through reenacting her grandfather's displacement. And she decided to do this on her own accord by shooting in black and white. So here she's reenacting him being evicted from the forest. And she also accompanied this with other photographs where she's trying to do close portraits evoking a kind of mood. Here, I think there's a sort of a sense of bewilderment and dislocation. Chastula was acutely aware of the positive ramifications of moving to the village. So the plus points of moving to the village were access to education, access to opportunities in terms of job employment and so on, that were in the process, they hoped, of being realized. but she also had a nostalgia for the forest. And in fact, the exhibition title, Sweet Like Honey, comes from her work. So she said, my grandfather used to show me how they used to collect honey. That was the best, the most delicious honey. They would eat it on its own. I have never had this honey because we couldn't go back to the forest. So this idea is that this honey that Renée picked up on in the interviews and that she developed for the exhibition title, this honey is the sweetness of the past, the thing that you're nostalgic about, but it's also that sweetness of a future that you're still waiting to arrive. Now, the main image on the exhibition poster was by Nyirahara Hamahirwe, Angélique, and here it shows an image of a woman with a hoe. Now, to many of you, this may seem like quite an ordinary image of agriculture. It's a woman and she's farming. But for the Batwa, for this historically marginalized community, it's really radical. And it's a radical form of reframing because they were not thought of as capable of farming in the past. So to see somebody like this who hadn't been thought of as capable of farming as successfully farming in her own field is a real sort of achievement. And this is also why the other photographs taken by participants of people with their cows are also radical. Historically, cow ownership in Nyabageni, well, in Rwanda, all over, was associated with Tutsi ethnicity. And it was also associated with power. Your kind of class and status might be associated with how many cows you owned and stuff. And that's why the government Girinka program, giving cows to much poorer people, has been really radical in trying to change perceptions and to bring people out of poverty. So that's why Jacqueline was so pleased to try and photograph Batwa with their cows, because this is a kind of image that hasn't been seen in Rwanda. So for a Rwandan to see this man and to recognize who he is and to recognize what he's doing is to really shift the frame on things. So in these images I've just shown you, photographers are layering temporalities and they're reflecting changes that they can see. But excitingly, many photographers also wanted to engage with imagining changes, the kind of things that they wanted to see. So in the article, this group of images we term as imagining social change, transformations inside out. And they include Beatriz Muhawenimana. She's wearing the purple here in this image. And she's standing here next to her sister, and they're facing different paths into the future. So her sister got married very early, has had children, and so on. Beatriz herself talks about as having escaped this, that she's trying to get out of that early marriage sort of cycle and try and sort of get more educated and forge a different future for herself. And she wanted to show that the issue of young marriage was holding women back, and she wanted to call for other kinds of possibilities. Now, Fidel Manishimwe took this idea of photographic activism through the image even further, this idea of gender politics and activism. He believes that one of the reasons why there is kind of a little bit of coercion and a little bit of sort of forcing people into young marriages might be because people don't court in public, people don't show their relationships in public, and that means that everything has to be hidden and isn't navigated in sort of more sort of social settings. And so what he wanted to do was to work with couples to get them to show their relationship in public as a way of starting a new conversation. And that's what he's doing in these images, showing a couple who are together, who would never normally show that they were together in public, and trying to use that. He says, the pictures are going to change mentality. If we see pictures of people who are open about their love, that will change how we behave. So he's searching here for a new kind of visual vocabulary. And then the final images I wanted to show were about changing the perspective on ways of seeing community. So in the article, we argue that photographing dancers invites people to look not from the outside, as they have traditionally, but instead from within. So photographs of this particular community always used to be taken by outsiders, often from a vantage point, from looking down and so on. But here instead, what we're doing is we're trying to show from inside. This photograph was taken by Piorine Umuhoza and is part of Shireen and Nyarabarimenchi's project. Shireen is actually wearing the orange t-shirt there. It's a project about dancers trying to show dance, what dance means for this community, but from within the community, not from outside. And you can see that in the way in which the photograph is composed, in the way in which it's taken from slightly below, so that you're sort of looking up, that you feel inside the community. In the space, you're actually surrounded by houses all around you. In the way that there's a feeling for the rhythm, that you can see that the click is taken on a particular kind of beat, right? That there's an intimacy here that you don't see in other work. Serhungo Diodone, another dancer photographer, said, I'm looking forward to us marginalized people who never used to be welcome, who felt separated. I'm looking forward to being with everyone, so everyone can understand us and understand what we are capable of. It will change people's mentality. They see us as people incapable of doing anything, but now they will see us working as part of us. I think that's so beautiful, that as part of us. So these images were shown in both Musanze and Nyabageni in June 2022, and later they were also shown in Kigali, the capital, to coincide with CHOGM, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. The participants themselves went on to form their own photography collective, and with the support of Rights for Time, they've opened their own bank account. They're holding regular meetings to plan ways to make money from photography, and they have cameras and stuff that we've left with them that they can continue to work with. So it's exciting that it's continuing to move forward after our work. Very briefly, our selected key findings are that the historically marginalized community in Nyabageni includes many, as I hope you've seen, many creative, talented members who are keen to engage with new media and artistic processes to tell their stories. That the Nyabageni artists use photography to reflect on the past, to show themselves inhabiting new roles in the present, and to articulate visions of change in the future. But they're consistently held back by lack of infrastructure and access to resources, and by short-term interventions without long-term structural change. And unfortunately, our intervention was one of those, because we weren't also able, with our budgets and parameters, to support long-term structural change. And Rwandan partners recorded changes to their own attitudes and ways of working, and that's very exciting because it's gone on to generate further ongoing projects, some with Rights for Time, some with other funders, some just including these voices in group exhibitions of Rwandan photography where previously they hadn't been included. And what we also found that's worth mentioning is that conducting engaged work with a very remote community like this, a very remote community, is logistically so challenging within current university structures. I've just been unshared, but I think that's enough that I've said there anyway. I'm running out of time. So thank you very much to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Beautifully delivered. I so much enjoy listening to you speak. I would like to invite Professor Temerez Fokouri to share with us her case study that she's led in Lebanon. Over to you, Tammy.
Thank you, Heather. It gives me indeed great pleasure to share with you today some of our findings on the Lebanese case study. So in the collaboration with the Center for Lebanese Studies and our wonderful fellows who are with us today, I have been leading the case of Policy Time on Lebanon at Rights for Time since the inception of the wonderful network. So in the next minutes, I'm excited to take you through our journey into the Lebanese case. I will discuss our research focus, methodologies and findings. Additionally, I'll touch upon how Lebanon's realities have also shaped our research. So just a few words on the background, and more particularly on the Lebanese case study and why it is so important to the Rights for Time. So Lebanon is a particularly fascinating case study when it comes to studying the intersection between politics, policy and temporalities. So as many of you know, historically, Lebanon has gone through several critical junctures and watershed moments, from conflict to humanitarian emergencies. So it is an empirical site for understanding fast-burning crises and their repercussions. At the same time, the Lebanese state is known for its long periods of political gridlock, political inaction, making the impact of slow policy time particularly debilitating and harmful for people's everyday lives. So think of traffic, slow internet, but think also of the protracted displacement of Palestinians, and of the stalled, frozen draft laws, such as the draft law that aims to grant Lebanese women the right to pass their citizenship to their children if they would marry a foreigner. So Lebanon is a revelatory case study for understanding policy time through the lens of slow-burning and fast-burning temporalities. At the same time, little work focuses on time and political temporality as units of analysis for understanding not only Lebanon's past history, but the intersection of its current crises with governance. When we first started the Lebanese case, we set out to explore the historical legacies and policy perceptions that have informed Lebanon's politics of reception towards Syrian refugees. Our goal really was to understand how refugee policies interact with a continuum of perceptions that accumulate over time. Oftentimes, refugee policy and crisis management governance seem to be the product of the fleeting moment. Additionally, humanitarian governance that's centered on resilience, adaptation, and crisis management fails to thoroughly address or understand the interaction between humanitarian frameworks and the complex temporal layers that communities grapple with. So as said, refugee policy was really our initial focus. Yet as Lebanon started grappling by 2019 with cumulative and overlapping crises, from the economic collapse, the pandemic, to the Beirut blasts, we slowly expanded our focus from refugee policy and time to crisis governance and time. It goes without saying that all of these temporalities are inevitably entangled. So having said this, much of our work really in the first years of the work focused on understanding time, crisis, and refugee policy through case studies informed by literature review, discourse, analysis, and interviews. Given that there is little theoretical work on political temporalities in Lebanon, we wanted to draw on case studies as exploratory tools for understanding the nexus between time and policy on the one hand, and as tunnels for theorization on the other. In the initial phase of our work, together with Lindsay Stonebridge and Ben Warwick, we tested the concept of an interdisciplinary temporal lens. We developed through webinars interdisciplinary peer-to-peer protocols in which we placed three disciplines in conversation with each other: politics, law, and poetics. In 2021, our team grew with the addition of a new postdoctoral research fellow, Nanor Garagosian. Nanor has conducted both conceptual and empirical research on refugee policy and temporality in Lebanon. I'd like to highlight some aspects of her work that have shaped our research framework. For example, Nanor completed a literature review on the temporal dimension and displacement studies in Lebanon, which will soon be available on our website. So please look out for it. Time emerges as a crucial concept in various studies on the displacement of Palestinians, Iraqis, Syrians, and Armenians in Lebanon. However, temporal variables are often not fully theorized or even examined. So the literature review aimed to emphasize these temporal variables by engaging them with the conceptual literature on temporalities, such as timing, sequence, frequency, synchronization, speed, duration, and the notions of past, present, and future. How are these concepts reflected in the literature on displacement in Lebanon? So the study of Nanor shows that these temporalities intersect with three levels of analysis. First, the individual lives of refugees. Second, broader social networks and community relationships. Thirdly, the policies and practices of humanitarian organizations, donors, political parties, and states. Another project developed by Nanor is a case study on the narratives of Armenians in Lebanon, decades after their ancestors first arrived as refugees. This case study is fascinating because it informs readers about how overlapping states and forms of displacement evolve over time, allowing us to understand how refuge and diasporization transform the communities and spaces where people reside. So the case study is set to be available online shortly. In 2023, we welcomed two additional wonderful research fellows, Stella Paish and Maria Malouf, who are with us today and who will talk in a minute about the case studies that they have engaged in. The research touches on policy time through the lens of refugee politics, but also through the lens of external interventions and conflicts. Maria has been working, for instance, on the so-called durable solutions that Syrian refugees have at their disposal, but these durable solutions are really not so durable. So she, in a way, unpacks in one of her concept notes how resettlement to a third country leads to various ongoing disappointments and how hope is shattered every step of the way. Stella has been working on temporalities through the lens of external interventions, a precious added dimension to our research framework. For instance, she reflects on the US intervention in Lebanon's conflict settings and how the US intervention created slow-burning and fast-burning crises. Our two research fellows will tell you a bit more about that. Regarding my own work, I have been working since 2023 on a monograph on Lebanon's post-war political system and time, with a view to understanding how the very life cycle of Lebanon's post-war political system shapes people's time. The writing process of the monograph is enriched by the rich conceptualization of time and temporalities at Rights for Time, and is really inspired by multiple case studies from Jordan, Palestine, and Rwanda. So I'm very grateful for this opportunity. Before I close, let me say a few words on dissemination. So far, we have had the opportunity to share our research framework in various conferences and policy-oriented platforms. We wanted really to attract attention to the importance of accounting for the long-term temporalities of crisis governance and how they inform international humanitarian governance on the ground. Two takeaways are worth highlighting, and then I will close. First, exploring the temporal dimension, as Kirsten said, reveals why policy templates imposed from outside often clash with local conditions. Secondly, it enhances our ability as researchers to craft policy and research solutions that are grounded in context and more responsive to actual circumstances. I will stop here, and I'd like to welcome Maria and Stella, who will talk briefly about their work and case studies, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have. Thank you for listening. Over to you, Stella.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'm Stella Peisch and very happy to be here today with everyone. And so as Professor Fahouri outlined, part of the remit of the Lebanon case study is looking at these briefs. So the one that I have completed that Professor Fahouri mentioned is looking at the 1958 in Lebanon, which was a year of a combination of violent conflict, polycrises, slow and fast burning crises, and looking at political temporality. So the experiences of time across all of these categories, and then also the different dynamics related to time experiences from the national, the regional, and the international level. So 1958, very, very briefly, was a year in which Cold War dynamics in the region between Egypt and Iraq and Lebanon, and dynamics between US approaches to the Middle East kind of all combined and intertwined. And it was the first US conflict deployment actually in the Middle East when they deployed in the summer of 1958 to Lebanon. And so by looking at this very specific period in a very specific context, we were able to unpack and untangle these different tempos and these different experiences of time from the national to the international level, and ranging from, slow burning, many years in the making dynamics to really day-to-day radical changes involving a coup in Iraq, and then the next day, US troops being deployed into Lebanon. So really unpacking a lot of these different dynamics. And then a second policy brief that is in the work right now that I'm looking at are the different temporal experiences of the lived experiences of Southern Lebanon. And so ever since it's been an ongoing dynamic, but also most recently since October, there has been a narrative around what are the experiences of South Lebanon vis-a-vis the rest of the country and other regions of the country. So what we've done is parsed out temporal experiences of the South across state formation and division, violence, temporalities of displacement, and temporalities really linked to the land, largely agricultural. And so that should be coming shortly. And so as Professor Fahouri mentioned, keep an eye on the Rights for Time platform. Thank you so much. Over to you, Maria.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tamirat and Stella. So I'm Maria Malouf, a researcher at the Center for Lebanese Studies since 2020. I joined the project in July 2023 and have been assisting Dr. Tamirat on the Lebanon case study with various research activities under the policy and time theme. Overall, I investigated previous studies and articles on first, how Lebanese politicians framed the 2019 Thawra or revolution, which is a pivotal movement in Lebanon's recent history. I covered mainly 4 key themes: the perception of protesters, fears of civil war, accusations of infiltration, and claims of external funding. And I concluded that by portraying protesters in various lights, from legitimate dissenters to potential instigators of civil wars, and so on, the politicians in Lebanon sought to shape the narrative and control the impact of the protesters. That's one example. Another study also, I explored the economic crisis framings by analyzing speeches from Lebanese politicians, and these speeches addressed various reasons for Lebanon's economic crisis, such as attributing it to internal issues or blaming external factors. Or some politicians as well argued that the economic crisis was exacerbated by the burden of the Syrian refugees crisis in Lebanon, or other by the withdrawal of funds from embassies. Also, I conducted a media and Twitter analysis about the controversy surrounding daylight savings time in Lebanon in March 2023, which resulted from Najib Mikati's, the Prime Minister's, decision to delay its implementation when he opted not to follow the international daylight saving time change, which resulted in a chaotic period of misalignment between local and global time and significant confusion and disruption. And also the major part of my work involved mapping the EU's activities in Lebanon since 2019, including EU projects, press releases and declarations and conclusions, targeting the following topic: economic collapse, political reform, Beirut Plus, and the civil society. And this literature review aimed to provide a comprehensive overview of the EU's action in Lebanon and the 3RF's effort to mitigate the consequences of the Beirut Plus. And by examining these initiatives, we gained a deeper understanding of the collaborative efforts and strategies to support Lebanon's recovery. However, most of these initiatives were limited to short-term efforts and did not extend to long-term development goals. In addition to the above, and as Professor Tamirat mentioned previously, and after a thorough discussion and guidance from her, I wrote a briefing, but it wasn't published yet on the website. It focused on addressing a specific phenomenon, which was the gap between the pre-settlement expectations and post-resettlement realities for Syrian refugees in Lebanon. It aimed to provide insights into the hopeful intentions towards resettlements among these refugees, and the examination of how 3 main factors, the socioeconomic, the legal, and administrative factor, shaped this hope. And it explored various post-resettlement experiences through the lens of emerging challenges. That's so far. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We'll have some time at the end for questions after all of the presentations have commenced. Really well done. So may I please invite Dr. Nora Parr to come up next and tell us about our research in Gaza.
Hi, I'm glad to be here with everyone. So like many of our case studies, our work with the Palestine Trauma Center in Gaza has shifted quite a few times over the course of the 4-year project, not least because of the vagaries of funding and stopping and starting, and also the new challenges that the Palestine Trauma Center, our partner in Gaza, has faced. I will explain a little bit at the end of the presentation where we are now, but do please, if you're interested, tune in tomorrow. Dr. El Tawil and David Harold will be speaking tomorrow at 3 o'clock on the latest bit of research from Gaza and sort of future directions. And so that will be a bit of a continuation. So the largest finding of the work is around a shifted locus of harm and how opening up temporal perspectives let us see harm not as a time-limited thing experienced by an individual, but by a series of processes that affect a much larger community. I'm going to talk you through the case study, the questions we started with, what we did, what we reset to do, some of our findings, and again, a little bit on where we are now. There we go. So project team, we have Dr. Mohammed Al Tawil, who will speak tomorrow, the founder and director of the Palestine Trauma Center, and David Harold, the chair of the board of trustees, myself, Dr. Rasha Bayoumi, with the wonderful research assistance of Abdullah Awad, Sarah Rockowitz, and Shada Shaheen. And thank you to everybody. And then, of course, Rasha, if you want to add in on the Q&A, please do. I'm sure there are things that I'm missing. So the research set about sort of collecting an evidence base, trying to understand a difference around trauma and mental health in a context where existing provision has been highly criticized. So Dr. Sameh Jaber, who's the head of the Palestinian Authority Mental Health Unit, has rather famously noted that it's the situation that's sick, not the individual. And she's been highly critical of large international mental health protocols that come and parachute in and try and treat the individual and kind of pathologize responses to a problematic situation by saying that the people need mental health treatment, but rather she says it's the situation that needs the real treatment and the people need tools to cope with it. We have, again, I come from a background of literature and questions around the representation of trauma through Palestinian fiction. And it's also the questions in the sort of psychoanalytic mental health field and the literary field are phenomenally overlapping. So from the literary field, right, the founding texts of the field of literary trauma studies largely failed to live up to their promise of cross-cutting cultural ethical engagement. They marginalize or ignore traumatic experiences of non-Western or minority cultures, and they tend to take for granted the universal validity of definitions of trauma and recovery that have developed outside of the history of Western modernity, right? And so our work with the Palestine Trauma Center was seeking ways of making accessible ways of talking about the differences between, we've seen lots of criticism of the problem, but then what are some of the solutions that are being offered? And as we know, the Palestine Trauma Center community faces siege, poverty, unemployment, domestic stress, COVID, and now the terror of night bombardment. This quote was taken in May. And so there are unimaginable new levels of trauma in the community of the Palestine Trauma Center today. And so what can we offer? What we learn from the Palestine Trauma Center offer to the field? The staff became fed up with the idea of recovery. In order to function on a day-to-day level, they could only aim to be strong in their suffering without hope for recovery, which goes against so many of the existing models of treatment recovery. And that just was not a useful paradigm. So we went to say, okay, well, what is happening? How is it happening? How can we understand what is happening and analyze it? And then offer some of those findings to a larger community. So given the existing limitations of trauma paradigms, what can we learn from the innovations of places like the Palestine Trauma Center? So their headquarters used to be in Nusayrat, which is an area in the very north of central Gaza. It was founded in 2004 by Dr. Mohammed Al-Tawil, who was born and raised in Gaza in Nusayrat, and now is resident in the UK. He runs and directs the center from the UK with a team of staff practitioners who are trained by Mohammed and a board that is based in the UK. It's a registered charity here. They offer programs for children, elders, teens, parents, women, men. Their collective aim is to create what Mohammed calls a competent community to address the mental health needs of a society under constant duress. So already we see a bit of a shift in the rhetoric around it's not the individual, but it's a much larger issue. So Mohammed received training in a technique called focusing, a method that was first introduced in Chicago by a man named Eugene Gendlin in the 1950s. Mohammed was very taken with the idea, and he spent the next 15 years translating, adapting, honing, and creating a manual for his staff to use to help to deploy what is now essentially an cultural adaptation of the focusing program, and that is what we set out to study. It's one of the most successful programs that the Palestine Trauma Center runs, and so we wanted to understand what made it successful and what made it different. The research really directly addressed gaps in the bigger questions of trauma and temporal frameworks, and then also much more local concerns around the provision of mental health services, around stigma, around sort of the critique of existing frameworks, and the need for materials that were consistently used across locations. So not only in Gaza and in this one area of Gaza, all over Gaza, but also in the West Bank, and something to be made available for Palestinians in all the locations where they are. So that was part of the larger aim of the work. How did we do this? Well, we set about offering training for the Palestine Trauma Center staff. We trained 11 staff members overall in qualitative methods and interview techniques. They were given the brief that we wanted to collect information on the sort of perceived success of the program and how it got that way. And so interviews were done of practitioners and of clients. The staff developed the questions themselves, and so we were also analyzing the way that the staff were understanding and how they sought to gain information on the perception of success. And we thought this way we are having the sort of the least amount of intervention, and we can collect information that is question and answer that are both relevant to the teams in Nusayrat. We collected data through the fall 2 years ago, and we have now concluded part of our analysis, and we have, I'll go through the results. These are sort of all of our planned outcomes, peer-reviewed article, methodological article, and then follow-on funding to help the Palestine Trauma Center sort of verify and then disseminate their approach much further. So I want to talk you through a little bit of the findings of our article, which is forthcoming in Frontiers and Public Health. The analysis of the interviews was fascinating, right? It revealed a sense and a definition of cultural appropriateness and responsiveness. So individuals felt that the focusing or Tarkiz program responded to their needs and gave them tools that they were able to use in everyday life. This chart sort of shows us how all of these elements are interconnected, right? So they felt it was culturally appropriate, and so they did engage. They engaged because they felt it is useful. The program, and interestingly, the questions that the practitioners or the staff members who were trained for qualitative analysis, the questions that they asked were also seeking sort of more information so that they could continue to better the program and respond to some of the needs that have been articulated by the clients. And so even at the level of research, the staff was continuing to respond to needs from conceptual all the way to very practical. So there was a huge amount of concern and initially we were a little bit stymied, like, why is there so much talk of, like, it was in a really convenient location. Almost every interviewee mentioned that it was at a convenient location at a convenient time. And in reading this in a sort of larger perspective, we're seeing that actually they're responding at a very minute level to the needs of individuals, so that it is at a location that is really convenient, that is really accessible, that makes it not only useful to get to for different sort of segments of communities, from moms with young children to sort of local elders. It is convenient in sort of all elements of the idea, right? So it is socially convenient, so it's not stigmatized. You're not going to a place where people are going to judge you. It is in sort of open community spaces, and it hosts sort of community. But at the same time, they're really able to create a sense of confidentiality, so that people can share things within the group without fear of it being sort of, shared more broadly. And so cultural appropriateness at once in community transparency, but also in giving a sense of safety to the people who are participating. This interesting porous boundary between the group doing the sessions, 12 sessions overall, generally spaced out over weeks. But again, responsiveness also means being responsive to the situation. And so if it is not safe to meet, then they don't meet. If it's not safe to meet in a certain location, they meet in a different location. And so individuals feel like there is no sense of being put at risk individually, culturally, in terms of mental health by the project or program. Sorry, pulling up my clock. There we go. Make sure I don't go over for you, Heather. So all of these elements are so interrelated. And what we saw as the huge overarching umbrella was that the Palestine Trauma Center defined the problem as a community issue, right? And so the individuals were empowered, right? And often the reasons people said that they accessed the programs were because they were no longer kind of functioning. They were no longer able to sort of take care of their children. They were no longer able to go to social events. Either they didn't want to leave the house because of a sort of a particularly traumatic moment, event, series, compounding cluster of events, or they just they didn't want to socialize anymore. They didn't want to be members of the community, and they sort of cut ties. And so the problem being addressed was one of social kind of contact and a sort of integrated fabric of society. And so by bringing individuals in, recreating a sense of community in the focusing groups, and then giving people tools to then a lot of the comments were around, I was able to use the techniques that I learned in the focusing sessions with my kids. And that not only sort of disseminates the focusing tools more widely, but also re-engages individuals within community. So the definition of the problem of poor mental health, or a mental health issue, as a community issue, and then empowering the individual as an agent of change who can then re-enter the community and sort of spread and disseminate the tools that they have learned. And that was also the way that they talked about their perceived change, right? Because they could then share what they've learned with other individuals and recommend the program on further. So around the methods dissemination, right, we had hoped to sort of sit down and really trace all the changes that had been made to the initial kind of focusing ethos, to the manual that PTC developed and was going to disseminate. They got follow-on funds to kind of finalize the manual in preparation for a randomized control trial. That work was still ongoing. In October, when sort of all kind of large research activity was halted, their center was very badly damaged in the first weeks of the sort of now 6 months. What are we in? 260 days of Gaza onslaught. The staff are dispersed across all areas of the Gaza Strip. We have paused this research because, on the one hand, we cannot continue to do it. There is no office. The sort of the verification of the manual has to pause, but also because we don't know if the manual is going to be the thing that is necessary anymore. And this is another sort of useful, important kind of set of questions that we've had to ask ourselves, right? One, what is the role of research amid a context of genocide? What is the role of the researcher? And then, of course, all of the time limits and the linearity of a sort of research program and project. And so we were faced with a problem, right? That research is conditioned by linear timelines, those same timelines that we're pushing against. And the wonderful team at Rights for Time has given us space to figure out what should we do next. So the problems are losing research. So all the research, all the funding that's been poured into this manual to trying to understand what it does and how it's different, there's a risk of losing the last stage of that. Losing the knowledge, losing the expertise, let alone, everything else that's going on. This is from a purely kind of research perspective. And then, of course, we need to understand what's happened. We need to understand the needs of the community going forward in order to be effective. So currently, our response is testimony collection. So we're working with Mohammed and the staff, and we are collecting testimony on what's happened, where staff has been displaced to, what are the conditions that some of the programs are being, so first, some of the programs are still being run. Focusing is being run in limited capacity by staff from UN shelters, from large compound family homes, from refugee tents in Rafah. It is being run as and when it is safe to do so. And so we're trying to collect as much information as we can on what that looks like, how it's being changed, how it's being adapted, so that we can kind of further understand how this program is useful, or sort of where the utility shifts given this like new layer of conflict and context. So we have so far fed into a UN Special Rapporteur call for evidence. We're creating a repository for future research, and we hope to help PTC create an institutional history so that they can use this down the line in their therapeutic work. So thank you very much, and happy to answer questions in the time that remains.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nora. We'll take some questions at the end. We've got our last case study presentation on Kenya. All right. Thanks so much. It's my pleasure to present to you a bit about a research that's been happening in Kenya. We call this case study Managing Time because it's all about looking at how we can learn from archives, records of violations that have been occurring to ensure that violations don't continue into the future. And I think the real kind of connection with Rights for Time is around notions of cumulative harm. In a way, we've even conceptualized this as ripples of harm. In that individuals who are suffering sexual violence in Kenya and elsewhere around the world, it's not just the moment of violation, but rather it's all of the moments that led up to the violation. It's all of the moments that then ensue once the survivor reaches out to find support, whether that be medical support, counseling support, or to report the incident to law enforcement for protection and for shelter, let alone prosecution. And in those instances, what we find when we look in places like Kenya is that survivors continue to suffer violation after violation, and in some instances, even death, because of the stigma, the shame that surrounds victimizations like these in places like Kenya. Survivors often risk their lives when they report these atrocities. So it's with the meeting of the Wangu Kanja Foundation, my students and I really abandoned a lot of the other research that we were working on because we were so taken by the tragedies that were happening to communities. And indeed, over half of women and girls, as well as boys, suffer sexual violence in Kenya. Men are also victims as well, but the demographic makeup that we see is predominantly female. So when I'm talking about survivors and victims, and I use those terms often interchangeably, I know that people define themselves in different ways, but just for brevity's sake, I will use the preferred term survivor. And likewise, when we're talking about survivors, I may refer to them as female, but it's with full acknowledgement that men can also suffer these horrific violations. So we set out to really try to understand how we could support through co-designed, co-developed research with the Wangu Kanja Foundation and other organizations, ways in which we could document these offenses. Because you see, if there isn't any documentation of these atrocities, then the government denies that they happen. And in places like Kenya and other low and middle income countries, there's not a government database of violations where people could go and look and see, well, what are the nature of violations occurring, let alone the numbers of violations that are occurring. So the first step, really, and an important lesson that I've learned in working with the Wangu Kanja Foundation is that you need to demonstrate that there's a problem that's occurring. And with great admiration, we set out to see what we can do to support what they were already doing, and that's building an app to then document these offenses and to mobilize survivors and communities to develop better legislation and resource for survivors, whether it be through medical or legal or counseling, this economic support that survivors need. Now, one of our launching points was the protocol for the investigation and documentation of sexual violence and conflict. This was a really interesting instrument that was designed to help strengthen the evidence base for bringing perpetrators to justice. But note that it's in conflict situations. And one of the lessons that I've learned in working on this project is that there seems to be a division within the global community that's concerned about sexual violence between those that study sexual violence and conflict and those who study everyday sexual violence. And this plays out with respect to funding. Funders, as of late, they tend to support projects that have to do with conflict, where sexual violence, for example, is used as a weapon of war or a weapon of genocide. But the fact remains that most sexual violence that happens around the world is so-called everyday violence. And so what can we do then to kind of shift people's focus into a longer-term frame, an appreciation that if you don't control or find a way to end everyday sexual violence, then you're not going to make any dents whatsoever in sexual violence in conflict settings, because those kinds of societies that are most ill-equipped to deal with everyday sexual violence then permeate and grow sexual violence that then erupts during times of disorder and conflict, or times when people are at increased vulnerability. So one of the things that my students and I decided we'd focus on is finding a way to take the protocol, which was extremely evidence-based. It focuses on investigative interviewing as a specialized skill. It also focuses a lot on the legal requirements of prosecuting sexual violence as a weapon of war. The difficulty is, however, that this protocol is going to be most useful on the front lines where organizations, often led by women and survivors themselves, are out there documenting these atrocities. And what we need to do, therefore, is to develop a protocol that's actually usable in these contexts, whereby there will be problems with, or so-called problems with literacy, problems with language, and problems with resources that are needed in order to make this training work. The protocol covers everything from how to create a safe environment for an interview, how to then use an evidence-based practice for eliciting information from survivors. But it takes for granted that we're working, for example, in a context like Human Rights Watch, where there are many more resources available to the people who work for that organization than there are for someone that's working, for instance, an organization like the Wangu Kanja Foundation. And so we wondered, can we develop a novel evidence collection tool that is low resource intensive, that's co-developed with survivors themselves, unlike the protocol, that it's a tool that then can be utilized by the organization after the project ends, because it does work with their systems and because they initiated it. It'll be something that'll be everlasting and that will be sustainable beyond the lifetime of the project. It's also critical in that we think about these testimonies, these documentation opportunities as being, really important for demonstrating the nature of crimes that are occurring for the purposes of identifying crime hotspots so we can prevent crimes, the nature of the testimony. If we find evidence-based ways of preserving and protecting it, then it's going to be more useful when cases are prosecuted. The techniques that we employ in developing the tool are these kinds of techniques that are known to bolster, strengthen memory, such that it makes it more difficult for people to forget over time, and it makes it more difficult for people to then be misled about their memories, because through the process of preserving that testimony, what we do is we make it better able to be retrieved, say 10 years on down the line when cases are finally prosecuted, which is often the case. It's really important to have this evidence because it demonstrates where policies are lacking, and where we might need to have better support for survivors because they're not able to process all the way through the case referral pathway, for instance, which is a piece of research that we conducted as part of this project. In that research, what we did is that we analyzed the data that are held by the Wangu Kanja Foundation. They've been documenting cases well before researchers came on the scene. And we're able to look at where cases are most vulnerable to attrition or falling out of the legal system, and what variables are most important with respect to where cases are likely to fall apart and not be investigated, where survivors are not able to get protection, or where cases are not able to be successfully prosecuted. And I'll share a link to that research in the chat, given the limited time that we have here today. But the thing I really want to stress is that the Wangu Kanja Foundation, they hold more data on the prevalence of sexual violence and the manifestations that it takes than any other organization, more so than the Kenya Demographic Health Survey, which is one of the largest, and it's government-backed instruments that's used to study violations. And even that, it's extremely limited. It's only intimate partner violence. It doesn't survey people who fall outside of very strict age range and so on. So their data, I think it's really important to raise the profile of it because it really shows the power of the community. And we are just here to see what we can do to support them in the endeavors that they're already going through. So I'm going to pass it over to Laura Stevens in a minute, a postgraduate student who's about to get her PhD, and the PhD is aligned to the Wangu Kanja Foundation case study project in Kenya. A lot of the focus of her work has been around developing this tool for eliciting information about crimes that are happening in Kenya today. And this tool is designed to be able to apprehend serial perpetrators. Again, we often think of a violation as being a one-off, but what we know in studying the perpetration of rape around the world is that it's often committed by serial offenders, with some estimates saying that serial offenders commit 300 violations before they're caught. So what can we do in a low resource environment where the police have limited resources to enable them to clear as many cases as possible and prevent future crimes? Well, one thing we might do is focus on studying the MO, the modus operandi, the signature of the offender and how they commit these crimes, so then we could link up the stories of survivors in such a way that it creates a very solid evidence base where it becomes impossible for the perpetrator to deny that these offenses are being committed, for the fact that we have so many people that are saying the same thing about these violations that all point to that particular perpetrator. And we've tested our tool in the lab. We find that it does elicit more information about MO. And we also find that it keeps memory intact for longer compared to the current methods that are in use in Kenya around eliciting testimony. Now I want to hand it over to Laura, who's going to tell us about a randomized controlled trial that she conducted as part of her PhD.
Thank you so much, Heather. I'm just going to share my screen. And hopefully that is coming through okay in just a second. Just mentioned, I'm about 10 days away from submitting my thesis. So what that means is that the computer really wants to give up. So my sincerest apologies for the very, very slow and lagging computer. But yeah, I'm going to talk with you today about the randomized control trial that we did as part of this case study. And obviously, as Heather has already mentioned, and we have Lady Wangu Kanja with us today, this research is absolutely not possible without Lady Wangu Kanja, the Wangu Kanja Foundation, and the Survivors of Sexual Violence in Kenya network. So they've consented for us to show this photograph, as well as having some people here with us today. Really want to offer our thanks to them for the co-design and data collection within this study. So as Heather has just mentioned, we first started this by looking at the mobile phone application that we've nicknamed MobApp for brevity, that the Wangu Kanja Foundation are using on the ground to document cases of sexual and gender-based violence. So we have previous literature that tells us we can document. Oh, I'm just going to pause because I'm lagging on my side of the screen and I'm not sure if it's lagging on your side as well, but hopefully you can hear me okay. So we've see from previous literature that by using alternative interview methods, such as a paper and pen interview format called the self-administered interview, that we can preserve memory evidence over time. So we wanted to replicate that using MobApp, and we did find that by using MobApp's questions, an early initial interview can preserve memory accuracy over time, which, as Heather has already mentioned, will be incredibly helpful for future criminal justice proceedings. But we also wanted to add those behavioural questions to see if we can gain information about that modus operandi, and we saw that it did not come at the detriment of the survivor's accuracy. So on top of that, we were also interested in understanding that MobApp doesn't happen on its own. The wonderful network and Wangu Kanja Foundation, they go out with the mobile phone to take the interview because of issues with technology and language. So based on the protocol that Heather's just mentioned, we know that they are not trained to systematically memory evidence. So we co-created an innovative interview training package, and we found that when we ran this training package on the ground in Kenya, that it actually improves their ability to perform best practice interviews. They use more rapport building behaviours and more ground rules administration. And that study is actually currently under review at the moment, and I'd be happy to discuss it further with you. So based on that, we wanted to understand whether combining our behaviourally informed documentation form and our innovative interview package, can we record more details from survivors on the ground that would benefit not only future criminal justice proceedings, but also having more access to data to advocate for policy and to understand about the patterns and characteristics of crime that are occurring on the ground and to locate crime hotspots. So to do that, we ran a randomized control trial. And overall, we trained 14 human rights defenders on the ground in Kenya to be our interviewers. And we had 3 stages to our randomized control trial. We had a before training data collection, where we looked at the same questions that are asked in MobApp. Here we've just called it the standard Wangu Kanja Foundation intake form because it's a paper and pen questionnaire in this survey. And we looked at before they were trained, how many details do they record? And then we looked at after they received the training, using both the standard Wangu Kanja Foundation intake form and our behaviourally informed form. Thank you very much, Heather, I can see that. We looked at what was the amount of details that was documented. So our findings then, as you can see on the screen, you've got the 3 conditions in different colours, and you can see a steady incline, which is really nice. So these are all significant findings where we see that there are more details being documented when we've conducted a training. So using the same form, just by training them, we're recording more information. But then when we add our behaviourally informed documentation form, we see it skyrockets and we document so much more information, and so much of that information pertains to the perpetrator's modus operandi, their behaviour, which can be used to facilitate crime linkage. And when looking specifically at each of our 14 human rights defenders, we can see that every single one of them increases the amount of information that they record using our behaviourally informed tool. So we can see that our training and our tool are incredibly successful at increasing the amount of information that is being recorded. So what does this mean then, and what's our recommendations for the future? We can see that we are really increasing the quantity of information that is being obtained, and that is going to be helpful for all of the reasons that I mentioned before. It's helpful for future criminal justice proceedings, but it's also helpful to understand the patterns and characteristics of sexual violence that is happening on the ground. This is going to help us with policy, and it's going to help us with what's called situational crime prevention. So by finding those geographical hotspots of crime and the time hotspots for crime, we can better place security measures to hopefully prevent further criminal offences from happening. And that will hopefully limit further intergenerational trauma. But we know that the quantity of information that we are obtaining is still of good quality based on our previous lab experiments. And we can really see the benefit of using an innovative interview training program. So that was based on the protocol that Heather mentioned, and it's improving not only interview best practice skill, but also the amount of information that's obtained. And we're hoping to use this in other contexts, but also specifically in Kenya in the upcoming election, fluxes of crime during the election periods. So we're really trying to roll out our training and our behaviourally informed tool in time for the next election. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you so much, Laura. All right, so we've got about 8 minutes now for questions. So I'd like to open the floor to any questions that you all have. If you want to, you could put it in the chat and I'll read it out, or feel free to turn your camera on and your microphone. Anybody?
Zoe.
If nobody else has a question, I have a question.
Great.
Heather, I was fascinated by what you said about funding for sexual violence being divided between genocide and ongoing conflicts and everyday lived experience, because it strikes me that that in some ways kind of goes to the heart of this, that we're kind of contesting whether these are so separate and whether they're actually much more interconnected. And I was wondering whether any of your work tries to make that case explicitly, that the two should be considered alongside rather than kept so separate.
Yes, so Kiki, Ben, and I are working on a paper at the minute that's on this very topic, looking at previous literature that connects everyday to conflict-related violence, and also looking at some of the data that we have on it that comes from databases on all sorts of violations, but masculine forms traditionally like homicide and other kinds of crimes, to see if there's a link between those and what we're seeing in conflict, and can you predict it? So it is an ongoing research study. It's difficult to investigate because, again, these contexts have very limited data, and the data that do exist, they're collected using very different research methods. So it's difficult to connect data sets together over time to be able to look at this properly. But nevertheless, we want to create kind of a wish list going forward about having, these online documentation systems. We could even look within a country to see where violations are occurring, and then look at election periods, for instance, to have a look at whether those are areas or regions within a country where we see more violence erupt during an election period. So it's an ongoing project. It's very interesting. I wonder if it also intersects with some of your work, Zoe.
Yeah, it absolutely does, Heather. So the reason why I ask is because I'm working on a collection of 100 stories that's being led by a genocide survivor about the genocide in Rwanda. And amongst those 100 stories, there are several stories that talk about sexual violence that has happened since the genocide, that is clearly connected to the genocide, but that is experienced as sort of part of everyday ongoing sort of after effects of violence. So I think there could be a lot of work that could be done in that area in Rwanda.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's also interesting. I'm also working on resurgent conflict at the moment. And what does it mean when you've had a period of peace and then conflict appears to be coming back? In a lot of ways, that's informed by sort of learning from the Palestine work and so on. Although arguably there wasn't ever a period of peace there. But what we're thinking about there is, I would be really interested to see what happens to gender-based violence there too. That when you have a threat of return of conflict, does that affect levels of violence?
Yeah, really interesting point. And I like the connection with learning as well. That's so key and important. Ben?
Yeah, if there's someone else that wants to come in because I get to ask questions all the time. I'm willing to cede, but otherwise I have a question.
Go for it.
Okay. So my question to anyone that's spoken that wants to take the question is, because part of what we're trying to do is knit together the themes and understand how we get these connections between the projects. So is there anything that you've seen from another case study that really has a real resonance to the work you're doing within your own case study? So is there anything you've heard today or in the course of hearing about other case studies that you've gone, wow, actually I could just copy and paste that and put it right into the context I've been working in, even though it's different context, different country, different traumas?
Well, in fact, we're hoping to learn from Heather and Laura and the team's work on sort of best practices around trauma testimony collection. We're hoping to continue the work that we're doing right now with the Palestine Trauma Center. And right now it is just gathering testimonies and information and just trying to understand what is happening and how it has happened and how it has affected treatment. And that's, you know, we're just collecting text messages right now. But in order to do that very delicate research, right, you only really want to ask one time, and you want to collect the best thing possible. So we're hoping to continue learning from our partners.
Thank you. Wangari. If you are saying something, you are muted, Wangari.
Oh, sorry, I'm having internet issues where I am. I think it's important that you raise the issue of the separation of the linkages between the everyday violations and what happens when we are at conflict. I think, especially if you look at Kenya, I've not done any data or research towards it, but it would be interesting for you to check, because you find that in the areas where we have conflict, especially because of the elections, most of those areas are very patriarchal in nature in terms of how even the status of the women are in the community. But also, if you look at the areas where other people have been sexually abused, but there's no prevalence of the patriarchy, it's usually committed by police officers. So the police officers, in reaction to whatever is happening, use sexual abuse as a weapon. But in some areas, you'll find communities that are fighting amongst themselves use it as a weapon of war, if I can put it that way. So it worries me when I hear that there's that even in the funding structure, that they have a way where they do not put as much emphasis on the everyday. And it also is scary coming from a country like Kenya, where as much as a lot of work can be put towards issues of sexual violence, we still have a long way to go in terms of educating communities, in terms of creating awareness on how prevalent it is, in terms of taking it seriously, because a lot of the times it is assumed to be, it's almost normalized, really. I think if some of you may have seen what was happening with the issue of femicide in this country from around January, we had several women being killed. And there was a big debate about whether we can qualify it as femicide, because how can we say it's femicide if we are not linking the killings to them being killed because they're women? So all these things are interconnected. So perhaps in your research, you might want to, you're the experts. I'm not. I'm just a human rights defender who has to deal with some of these things every day, and as much as also support the work that the Wango Kanja Foundation is doing. But I think that there is need to put the connecting dots in all these things. Check the communities where the prevalence is, where the high numbers are, how are they relating with women there, and also look at the aspect of the security sector and the role that they play in using sexual abuse as a weapon when we are in conflict. Though the kind of conflict we have in Kenya is not like what you see in Rwanda. It's mainly political. It's mainly political demigods just sponsoring one side against the other. So it's intertribal most of the time, more than, and being over 40 tribes in this country, that's where the difference maybe with Rwanda comes from. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Wanjeri. And I think I would challenge you. I think you're the expert. That we're here to learn from you, and we've learned a lot, so much in the last 4 years of this project as well as previous projects we worked on. So thank you for your comment, Martha.
Thank you, Heather. My question is to Zoe. I recently found myself on a jury of material coming from Rwanda talking about the genocide, and it was really very triggering, like the remnants of the genocide. However, in Zoe's presentation, it seemed like, people have kind of moved on. There's some beauty and joy in the photographs being depicted. And my question is really for Zoe to comment on, like, the mood in Rwanda. Like, does the genocide still linger among people? And how did her project kind of, if any, register this kind of mood or pain or agony that surrounds the whole occurrence of the genocide in Rwanda?
Thank you, Martha. That's a fascinating question. I'd love to hear more about that jury that you were on. Does the genocide still linger in Rwanda? Yes, in Rwanda, overall, yes. In Nyabageni, it is layered with so many other histories of difficulty. And so so that displacement from the forest, histories of discrimination and so on, sort of layer with it. But where it kind of lingers really is in a sense of instability, where you have Rwanda right next to Congo, and Nyabageni is really on the border, and you have rising anti-Tutsi violence in Eastern Congo now, and you have refugees, and you have a kind of a sense that there's a sort of, it's becoming more and more precarious there. And so there, it's not just lingering, it's kind of a feeling of a return of concern, of rising concern again. It came out to a certain extent in the photographs, although nobody specifically, and Renee, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think anybody specifically took photographs to evoke the period of genocide. But in the stories they told about their stories, they were talking about it. And then we went on to include two voices from the community and Richard Nakirutimana's voice in the 100 Stories collection that I just mentioned earlier to Heather. And in that, Daniel Nduwayezu talks about how the incursions from Congo into Rwanda in the aftermath of the genocide, how people were killed then. And he also talks about how more recently there have been sort of incursions that were sort of put down by the government. And so his story is very much about a layering of terrible memories of what happened in 94, in the instability in that region, in the aftermath of 94, and what has happened more recently with changing political situations. So I do think that memories of genocide are both there and they're increasingly alive, given the context of what is happening politically with Congo.
Thank you, Zoe.
Thank you, Martha, for the question.
Right. So I think we're up to a break. There'll be other opportunities for us to discuss linkages across the research. These that you heard about just now are case studies that were proof of concept case studies, which then led to several other projects that iterated on the themes that we identified in the case studies. So we'll pick those up, but for now, let's take a 10-minute break and then come back. So we'll see you then at 3:15 BST. So in about 10 minutes time. Just giving everybody just a second. Okay. Great. So it is my pleasure to introduce Rana Baruti, who led our How to Time Travel art exhibition. So excited to hear more about the project. Over to you, Rana.
Hi, Heather. Can everybody hear me? Hi, everyone. Such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for giving me the time to show you this project and for making this project possible. Let me share my screen. I'm going to start with a short video just to give you a sense of the project that we embarked on together. This is maybe something a little bit different than the conversation you've been having recently. Obviously, the Rights for Time Network graciously wanted to see something more in the field of arts in a sort of different context to the work that you have all been doing, which is equally important. And as you know, art is something that can raise a mirror to the world and, reveal certain things, change people's minds, open up new perspectives. And this is what we tried to do with the participating artists that exhibited with us. They're artists from across the Arab region. And I'll start with this video, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about the themes and the project and the artworks that they created in response to the theme that the prompt that we gave them. So I hope that this works well.
Trouve traduction, alors ils trouvent leur.
I hope that wasn't too choppy. So How to Time Travel is the name that we gave this project. Let's see. Is that all right? Yeah, perfect. So yeah, How to Time Travel is the name that we chose for this project, this program that we did with the artists and the exhibition that resulted. So it's an exhibition that presents a series of commissioned and selected work that explore notions of estrangement and displacement. We invited 7 artists to think about the dimension of time, both past and present, and how time can be used to create some form of a reorientation or a sense of belonging when it comes to feelings of estrangement and displacement. So the participating artists are all from very different backgrounds. They work across multiple disciplines and mediums. Some of them are conditioned artists. Some of them are more kind of like photographers. Some of them come from more of a digital background. Some of them more from a crafts background. But we all came together to try and think about this idea of home and how we can develop what we've called homing devices, which are kind of like the vehicles or instruments or rituals or tools for navigation and orientation that kind of direct us towards this feeling of home, even if we can't access it from a geographic standpoint. So with that, we had very interesting discussions with the artists to try and expand that idea of home into one that, transcends the physical or spatial realm, that is confined by national borders and is instead understood as a vast terrain and emotional landscape of lived experiences, of affinities, connections, sensations, sentiments, objects, emotions, and with the dimension of time, of course, memories and visions for the future. So in that sense, acts of approaching home, encompass this nonlinear movement through time and doesn't really only rely on nostalgia or looking back in time to a time that you were at home, but also invites speculative visions of the future. So I'll walk you through some of the artistic interpretations of this theme that came out. This is Noor Bseso, and her piece is called Approaching Haifa. So Noor's family is originally from Haifa in Palestine and have been displaced and are now living in Jordan. And so she has recollected what she has heard from various family members about Haifa. And she's created this beautiful 3D art piece. You can see that she's, she has the gramophone, she has the books, like different cultural items, the food that is known from Palestine. And she's created this kind of a 3D, three-dimensional experiential piece. Her background is in set design, and so that's why she wanted the canvas to come off the page, off the wall. And what she's looking at is the Hijaz Railway, which is the train that used to run through Palestine, connecting all of the different cities together. And so she's imagined actually not the past, but a future Hijaz Railway in which, all of the cultural dimensions of Palestine come together in one kind of a scene that she's imagined. Also digging into the past and into past memories is Noor Bshuti, who has created a really emotional and beautiful piece. Noor Bshuti's father, Ghassan Bshuti, was an artist and not a very well-known artist, but a prolific artist. He used to paint mostly landscapes like the one you see here of Palestine. And he passed away when she was quite young. And so she grew up and studied art and became an artist. And part of her interpretation of the theme was to try to reconnect with her father, the artist, and see how her practice and his practice were linked. And in her conversation with her, she always talks about how, although she has his archive of paintings that he's left behind, it's never, a 20/20 vision when you look back at what he has done and who he is. And so what she started to do is to blur that vision digitally. And so she came up with this kind of pixelated view of that landscape artwork. And she worked remotely with some woman based here in Jordan, Palestinian woman who embroidered her digital rendering of her father's painting, but using hand embroidery and using obviously the cross-stitch techniques which Palestinians use. And actually this was the multiple layers of digging into what it means to be an artist, of her father, of the landscape of Palestine, of working with a craft such as embroidery, led us to actually use the digital version of this for the poster of the exhibition. And then we have Shireen Mufti. Shireen is a Jordanian artist, and she was reflecting also on the past and thinking about Bedouin communities here in Jordan and how they've become displaced due to urbanization and how their way of living is now being erased. And so you can see in the 4 canvases that she's presented, there are clear omissions of cultural aspects of their lives, whether it's, the teapot that's missing or the clothes or, different elements that, give these figures their cultural identity. And the way it's displayed is kind of like this archaeology of forms. And you kind of see that, it's this erasure of not just a culture, but also of like the architectural and urban practices that these, or rural practices that these Bedouins traditionally would practice in favor of cities, unfortunately. The exhibition, I'll just comment about the space because I think it's very beautiful. The exhibition was hosted by a foundation here in Jordan called MMAG, and they have an old heritage home in the middle of Amman, and it overlooks the city in a very beautiful way, as you can see. And so what they've done is they've renovated this home and made it into an art space. And so that's very much in keeping also with this idea of an art space being encompassing sort of the cultural practices of the region. And so we have Tamara Kalo, which we placed in front of this window with the view in the background. And one thing we have to say is this exhibition took place in January when it was supposed to take place, I believe last October or November, and we had to delay because of the emotional strain of the eruption of the genocide in Gaza, and so there was a lot of emotional strain on the artists. We didn't feel like it was in keeping with the emotions of the time to go ahead with the exhibition. And Tamara was one of those people who actually had an artistic, piece in mind, and then had to change it in response to what was happening, and in a more honest way. And so what she's been reflecting on is the piece is called Olive Leaves Memories. And what she was reflecting on is the fact that Palestinians this year weren't able to harvest their olives as they would have every year. She created this piece entirely using olive leaves and different photo printing techniques. So you can see that she's actually embedded some olive leaves into this plastic cover, but then also done all kinds of prints using the sunlight. And the different ways you look at the piece, you kind of read the olive trees differently. And her idea is that, how she incorporated time is that she says, people come and go, civilizations come and go, there's all of these conflicts, but the sort of our real ancestors are these trees that have been in the landscape forever. And she's saying if the olive could speak, what kind of a book would it write? And that's what this book is. Because we rarely listen to these, ancient beings that we share the land with, and unfortunately they're being destroyed in the context of this conflict. And this is Tamara explaining it to some of the visitors. She also did a wonderful workshop that invited the visitors to actually produce pieces on their own as well. So that was part of the ongoing program in line with the exhibition. Hisham works in virtual reality, so he created a little virtual space, which he called Meta Home. And within this virtual space, he embedded a bunch of stories that he used to take from his grandmother, who talked about the Nakba when she left Palestine. And her stories, as you can tell from the imagery, are full of violence and are quite disturbing. And so he wanted to create this universe of her memories in the way that he understood them. And so this was a virtual reality that you could wear and try to experience his idea of an emotional landscape of home. This was not a new commission, but it was a very relevant piece that we wanted to include within the exhibition. It's a video piece by an artist named Badi Dalloul. It's in French and it's called Ahmed the Japanese. And it tells the story of a generic Arab man from, unclear whether it's Egypt or Syria or Jordan or, the Gulf. And his name is Ahmed. And Ahmed leaves the Arab world to live in Japan. And it tells the story of how difficult it is as an Arab to suddenly try to become a Japanese, which is the main premise of the story. And the absurdity of that disconnect of culture, but then how he sort of contends with it. It's about 45 minutes long, the film, and it was screened during the exhibition and people could come in and watch it, and it was a big hit. The last piece I'll talk about is Ra'fat Majzoub, who's a Lebanese artist. And this one was, I think, a very emotional piece at the time when we exhibited it. What Ra'fat's proposed was a deck of cards, which he called Dua Express. A dua in Arabic is a prayer or kind of a wish that you make in a spiritual sense. For yourself or for your future. So what's interesting about this piece is he's really looking at speculative futures in terms of how to time travel. And so what he created is almost like a tarot card set. And he imagined it being set up within this idea of a Jannah or Jnene, or which is a paradise, translates to paradise. And is also the word that we use for garden. So he's created this fake garden with flowers and the deck of cards displayed there. And so the way you use this deck of cards is really up to you. He doesn't leave much instructions, but we ended up doing a wonderful session where we had we did readings for each other. And it was at a time when, as I said, everyone was very emotionally distraught, and I think people were looking for any sort of like hope for the future, or any glimpse of something to look forward to or to think about. And when we played with these cards and we gave each other readings, it kind of was a very therapeutic process, allowing us to process the trauma that we were facing. And so there are some cards that have negative connotations like shame and fear, but then you also have connection, beauty, and you have all kinds of very positive cards. And I think people were really able to use them as tools for better understanding themselves. And so these are some images of the sessions that we did, where we were reading for each other and kind of just having a space for sharing and for comfort. So those are all the images that I have. And I think, upon reflecting, a few months later, I can say, that while the resulting works manifest in tangible objects, as you see in the exhibition, a reconstructed or deconstructed painting, a deck of cards, or a book, their journeys all involve an interplay of fact and fiction. So in a lot of the works, the imagined protagonist of these time-bending narratives often is like a archetypal figure, an olive tree, a distant sound, a father's painting, or a grandmother's prayer and stories. And the spin that the artists have given it leave us thinking about these objects in a different way. So this kind of layering of real and made-up worlds where historical facts are altered, embellished, or intentionally omitted, these are, I think, where lived experiences are narrated and re-narrated, manipulated, or made up altogether. This is where I think the beauty of art really lies. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rana. It was a real pleasure to see the artwork and hear your perspective and talking us through on that. So Rana, she's an independent curator as well as a consultant. I've put her website in the chat so that you could see the exhibit that she was just talking about, How to Time Travel, but also the other fantastic works of art that she's curated and done research on. It's really fabulous, Rana. We're going to have a virtual gallery that portrays the exhibit soon. It's an interactive website that's currently being developed. Rana and her team have finished 5 out of 8 artists, and so it will be coming to us really soon. And you could see it by going to the Rights for Time website. And from there, there'll be a landing page that'll take you to the interactive website featuring the exhibit. How long will it be up for, Rana?
Oh, it's already done, but hopefully the online gallery, which you just mentioned, will kind of eternalize it. We're hoping to also have some interactive features in there so that anybody who would like to, play with those cards and, make a reading for themselves can also do that. So
fabulous.
Coming soon.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Do we have time for a couple of questions, Anela?
We do for about 4 minutes.
Oh, great. So I'd like to open it up to the audience. Questions for Rana about the exhibit? Yes, Nora.
Hi, Rana. Thank you so much for sharing. It's been such a pleasure to see it all come together, and in such a difficult time. I wonder if you could talk us through and share a little bit how you got to the time travel, right? I mean, we handed you this at the best of times, really heavy brief on like, please visualize time and trauma. And then Gaza happens. And then you're approaching artists who are, digging deep and feeling all the things and putting it out there. And, it's not a time where you want to be more vulnerable because your feelings just feel like they're on your skin. So I wonder if you can talk us through the process of how you got to the kind of artist brief that you arrived at, sort of translating the request for visualizations of time and trauma to this question of home and time travel.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. It was I think you were also along on the ride with us. It was quite a challenge, and actually we had some artists who, rightfully so, and with all respect to them, decided not to continue because they were feeling so challenged by the emotions at the time. And I think that what we ended up doing actually was so much more in line with time and trauma, because it ended up becoming a vehicle itself, this processing what's happening in Gaza and using this exhibition and using, their ability to create these artworks as a way for themselves as artists to process the trauma they were living was really important. You see a lot of the works are about Palestine, and a lot of them are also kind of about what can we do to support each other at this moment. And that was a really beautiful thing. So it was really artist-led in the most beautiful way. I think we came in with a brief, and then as Gaza started to unfold, we started to shift and have more honest conversations with the artists, saying, what do you guys want to do? We understand, now is not the best time to come out with this big blockbuster exhibition, and audiences are kind of, distraught and not really looking for, going to the next art opening. So how can we transform this into sort of an experience where we grieve collectively and try to think about how we can best tell the story. So while the artworks aren't directly related to Gaza, I think they're very, very personal. We tapped into something very emotional from within the artists, and I think a lot of them, many of them being displaced from Palestine as well, but also sort of just empathizing with what's happening, were led to this idea of home. And so that's kind of how it ended up becoming this idea of time travel. If we can't access home, by taking an airplane and going there, how can we access it within our own minds and within the dimension of time?
Thank you, Rana. Time for one more quick question.
I've got another one. Can you walk us through what a reading of the Dua Express cards looks like?
Yeah, I mean, listen, everybody kind of did it their own way. Some people are had a background in, tarot card readings, and some people were just kind of like playing around with it. But one exercise that I really liked was that you would pick 3 cards out of the batch, and one would be your card for the past, one would be for the present, and one would be for the future. And so I think for a lot of people there was, if they had something like a negative card in the past, it was kind of like they could relate to it and process something. And so they, I was surprised by the openness, because they would be sitting across strangers and they would pick out a card for their past or present or future, and start just sharing their story and sharing their trauma and sharing how they felt about it. And if there was a card, that was positive about the future, they would be like, I really hope so. And so it kind of left everybody in a happy mood. Some people do it differently. Some people, picked 5 cards and tried to see the relations between them, and we kind of left it open for people to use them as they like. And a funny story about it is, a week later we were at a cafe just having coffee, a friend of mine and I, and there were 2 people on the other table who were still using those cards, who had, I guess, come to the exhibition or picked up an extra deck of cards from the exhibition because we were distributing them and, sharing them with their friends. And so it kind of became something that you could see across the city, where people were picking up cards and playing with them. And that was a wonderful thing.
Wonderful.
And I have to say thank you so much to Nora and Ben and the team for like the total openness that they gave us in terms of, fostering a really open space for the artists to work. It was a really incredible experience.
Thank you. Thank you so much for really enabling us to better visualize these concepts that we've been struggling and working with and looking for synergies across projects. And I think this exhibition it captures, better than anything we could have imagined in the way in which it portrays the Rights for Time network and in the context in which it's embedded, or context, I should say. So thank you, Rana. Please, everybody, visit Rana's website and do return to the Rights for Time website in the near future to attend the interactive exhibit online. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's my pleasure now to introduce Professor Lindsay Stonebridge. She's a fellow of the British Academy and a professor of humanities and human rights at the University of Birmingham. And today she's going to talk about the Rights for Time network, and she's going to do this by drawing on her latest book, We Are Free to Change the World, Hannah Arendt's Lessons in Love and Disobedience. So over to you, Lindsay. We're delighted that you're here.
Hi, can you all see and hear me? Okay, yeah, I have one slide. I'm not going to say that much because I'm just blown away by this afternoon. Really blown away, and I find it quite emotional actually to come to the end of this project and just see what people have done. While people were doing this work, I was writing a critical creative biography of Hannah Arendt. I'll just show you the cover. It's only to show you that she's very cool, and she's looking sorrowful. And as time progressed, that picture she got more and more sorrowful. But I was thinking first off today that Hannah Arendt kind of connects us a little bit with the beginning of this project, which is probably happened about 1948, I think, the beginning of this project, which is to say, I'm a historian, when that moment when human rights and humanitarian protection, as we now work within it, was established. And that was happening in 48 with the UN, the Declaration of Human Rights Refugee Treaty. And Hannah Arendt had an issue with the protection that was being offered, or the framework that was being offered. And she said, after, in the period post 1945, what most people were asking for was not humanitarian protection. That's not the first thing you ask for. What people asked for is what she called the right to have rights. Not just the right to be protected, not just the right to be looked after, or not to be hurt, or not to be starved, or not to be ignored, but the right to have rights. What did she mean by this? She didn't really give us too much to go on, but one of the things she really meant was the right to be in the conversation, the right to be visible, the right to be in public, the right to have conversations about what rights might mean, the right to argue about rights, the right to be seen. And from the moment we started this lunchtime, what I was struck by was the work, the kind of very Arendtian work of making visible time and history in really, really striking new ways, right from the amazing photography that Zoe's project was bringing out, literally out of the forest into this transitional phase, right the way through to Rana's mind-blowing, actually, exhibition at the end. So that emphasis on visibility, which for Arendt was very political. It's not just the right to be seen and pitied, it's the right to be seen and engaged, the right to be seen in action. What does that have to do with time? Arendt's concept of time was very much centered on what she called the world. And the world for her is something we share as human beings, but we share with the past and we share with the future. And so it's not just the earth, it's not just politics. There's this thing called the world that connects us to the past and to the future. And what she would also argue is there are ways of being and not being in time. So to be in the world is to have a relationship with the past and the future. It's not just to be inserted in a kind of chaos of time or just victim to time. And one of the things that she said does that well, one thing she does it supremely is the actions we all make as human beings, but is art and narrative. It is art and narrative give time where time has been taken away or deprived. Time is through which we are human. She learned that from philosophy, but it's also very much that kind of sense of narrating that relationship between the past and future. And I've just seen that again and again in new formations happening throughout the afternoon. I think Martha talked about, again, in relation to Zoe's presentation, beauty and joy. Joy is a word Arendt uses a lot. You wouldn't think so, because she's a great analyst of totalitarianism and genocide, but she uses the word joy an awful lot. So when Martha used that word beauty and joy, that really stung for me. And that's also because the other thing that Arendt really thought was important for our politics and our history was the work of the imagination, to imagine oneself in time, but also crucially to imagine what the world that we share looks like from other perspectives. So she was really into what Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, the 18th century philosopher, called the ability to travel in the imagination, the ability to go visiting, and the importance of the ability to go visiting other people's perspective. And she didn't mean empathy. She wasn't really into a hierarchy of, oh, I feel sorry for you, I see where you're coming from. She meant, no, really, really, what the world looks like from someone else's perspective. You don't have to even like it or empathize with it, but you have to be able to imagine it before we can do anything. And that I saw again and again and again throughout the project. Just two more things. I'm going to make two more points, and I'll just read a bit of the book, which I think tries to connect up with Rights for Time at its most direct. So what happens, and this project has responded to this, what happens when that world is broken? And it's not just that the world is broken in one definitive break. I mean, Arendt said in the 20th century finally broke the world, and everything we're living in now is the consequence of a world that is irredeemably broken. That's what she thought. And it's broken again and again and again. So we've spoken a lot about the time of crisis, the time of rupture. And that can be a time of hopelessness, real hopelessness. But one of the things that I've always, I came to like more about Arendt, I came to appreciate more, is the very kind of pessimism of her view, the hopelessness, the broken world, the lack of agency, are also the moments where you see a different world come into view. And I felt that again very strongly today. And what she really didn't like is she hated ideologies, she hated false narratives, she hated things that papered over the gaps, she hated easy answers. And she thought our responsibility to the world, she spoke about the love of the world a lot, and I saw a lot of that today as well. She spoke about a love of the world, means really facing up to what the world has become and our place in it. So she was a thinker who really fought against delusions and false narratives. And I wrote, this is just one sentence I wrote in the beginning of this book. She's very good at telling us about the madness of contemporary politics, but she also teaches us that it's when the experience of powerlessness is at its most acute, when history seems at its most bleak, that the determination to think like a human being, creatively, courageously, and complicatedly, matters the most. So it's when the experience of powerlessness, when we've actually been forced out of time, is at its most acute, when history seems at its most bleak, that the determination to think like a human being, creatively, courageously, and complicatedly, matters the most. I was moved is not the right word, when those words were quoted back to me by Raja Shahadi, who's a Palestinian activist and writer. Some of you will know his book, Palestinian Walks, extraordinary piece of writing, where he'd been reading my book and reading Arendt in February. And he said, this is the place from which we start when you've been punched out of time, is when the work of imagination and creativity and determination matters the most. And I think, again, we have seen that throughout this afternoon's exchanges and presentations. With that thought in mind, I'm just going to show you one last slide and one more picture, if I can share my very messy screen share. Oh no, it's not going to let me do it. Sorry.
You should be able to, Lindsay.
No, it'll just, I haven't done the settings, so it's asking me to go and do the settings, which is far too complicated for me to be able to do. So let me, yeah. So there's nothing coming up there, right?
No, not
Yeah.
as yet.
No, I wasn't going to use this slide, so this is my incompetence. Let me just try once more. Share, existence preferences. Okay. No, it's not going to let me, but I shall show you.
Can you have a go and share mine? Is it the slide that you've sent to me?
Yeah, it's just a slide I said. Yeah, it's just one picture.
Bear with me.
Yay. There she is. Great. When I started this book, I was maybe hoping it could coincide with Rights for Time in a more direct way. But COVID happened and other things happened, and that didn't happen. But yeah, I'm going back here to Stella's presentation and to Maria's presentation on Tammy's work as well in Lebanon. At the very beginning of the Thora in Lebanon in 2019, I was scrolling through Twitter and I found this, I was amazed to find this mural, which is taken from Hamra, which is the kind of nice booky university ice creamy part of Beirut. And it's a picture of a woman sitting on a bench, and behind her a revolution is taking place. This is just before the revolution happened. And if you look carefully, what the woman is reading is Hannah Arendt's book called On Revolution, which up until very recently was her only full-length work to be translated into Arabic. It was translated pretty soon after it came out in the 60s. And this mural was painted by a woman called Diana El-Halabi, who was an artist who was based in Beirut, but is now in the Netherlands. And she said she knew she wanted a picture of a woman reading on a bench. I knew the book should be on revolution, but she didn't at that time know that Arendt had written a book on revolution. She does now. She's read it several times, and been a lot of debate about Arendt's place in thinking about revolution. Arendt made the point in Revolution, and we come back here to that point of hopelessness and when you seem to be pushed out time. What Arendt never gives up on is the time of new beginnings and the time of action. There's always a space for action in which something new will happen, and that too is a dimension of time. So I was very, very taken with this painting because it allowed me to think about the relationship between Hannah Arendt's work and our times, and the times that have been discussed in the Rights for Time project more clearly. So I'll just read you a little bit that I wrote towards the end of my chapter on revolution, which was inspired by Diana El-Halabi's work, and particularly this painting. A woman reads a book alone on a bench, thinking about revolution. Behind her, an actual revolution is taking place. She could be Hannah Arendt at any moment in her life. How to think in solitude whilst responding to events happening around us was one of her abiding questions. In 1961, Arendt published a collection of 6 essays entitled Between Past and Future. It was her personal favourite of her books, and alongside Revolution was the only other of her works to be translated into Arabic before the end of the Cold War coincided with the end of Lebanon's civil war in 1990. Now, the preface to that book is called The Gap Between Past and Future. You could say the preface to the book is like Rights for Time, the gap between past and future, and is a short, dense, experimental piece of prose, and is one of my favourites amongst Arendt's writing. Each time I read it, I feel both as though I am back in the 20th century with Hannah Arendt, battering against its darkness, and as though I have never read this text before in my life, as though its words are pulling me into the future we are perhaps only now on the brink of imagining. She begins by quoting an aphorism written by a friend from her refugee years in Paris, the poet René Char. Our inheritance was left to us by no testament, René Char writes. Our inheritance was left to us by no testament. Arendt describes this as strange and strangely abrupt. Char has spent the war fighting with the French resistance. Freedom, Arendt eventually says, is what's so strangely condensed in his words. At every meal we sit down together, he wrote in another aphorism, freedom is invited to sit down. The chair remains vacant, but the place has been set. She says, does something exist, not in outer space, but in the world and in the affairs of men on earth, which has not even a name? She asks next. What is this strange kind of freedom we are waiting to join us at the table? Freedom has not one, but many names. In America, in 1776, it was called public happiness. The French in 1789 called it public freedom. They called it Kelonyani Kelon in Lebanon in 2019. All of them means all of them. In 2022, it was woman life freedom in Iran and Kurdistan and Slava Ukraini in Ukraine. When activists shouted, I can't breathe, quoting George Floyd's dying words in 2020, they were also putting the demand for freedom into new words. Arendt's point is that there's no one form or name for freedom that could be easily passed through the generations. Our inheritance was left to us by no testament. There is no testament, says Char, no testimony, no narrative form for this experience. There is no freedom manual from the past. Freedom lands differently each time, or it does not land at all. But there is still our inheritance. Freedom does not happen in a timeless vacuum. The dead leave their wills. They want us to act by using our wills. When we act for the future, we are also meeting our obligations to the past. This sense of being within a long political tradition of freedom was also very, very important to Hannah Arendt. 60 years ago, a woman, a refugee from totalitarianism, wrote a book on revolution. Hannah Arendt is now part of our inheritance. Now, another woman carries that book in her handbag. She's in Beirut, but she could also be in Iran or Afghanistan. She could be in Minsk, Belarus, Moscow, or Texas. She could be anywhere in the world where women have had enough. The book is her secret. In its pages, she reads about how the most unexpected events can suddenly prompt people to step out of the shadows. She cannot put the book down. She takes it out into the streets, through the security checkpoints, and sits reading on a bench in the sunlight. Hours later, she looks up from her reading to find that her city is different. Something is happening. A rainbow shoots across the sky. This is a moment, she whispers to herself. Pay attention. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lindsay. We have time for a few questions. Ben.
Yeah, it's lovely to hear from you, Lindsay, and lovely to hear your wonderful writing as well. I think one of the themes you just reflected on was about that look to the future. And I think that's something that's really come out. I've been consistently surprised by how much that's come out in some of the projects that have been done through Rights for Time, that despite the horrific pasts and horrific presents, actually that look towards the future is always still there, always present. And I just want to hear you talk more about that, how Arendt frames that, how you frame that is it optimism about the future? Is it just a necessity to keep the future in mind? Or how does that fit really? And can you say a bit more?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. That's a great question. I mean, Arendt always cautioned against reckless optimism, which she thought was as bad as self-indulgent despair. So she doesn't use the word hope very much, although she does talk a lot about beginning and beginning again. And she was a refugee for 17 years, so she has that capacity to keep on beginning. But your question reminds me of two interventions I've had on the since I've published the book. One was just last week, and I was giving a paper and in a British university, and a person who happened to be a man said to me, "I've read a little bit of your book, and I think it's much too optimistic. Where do you get this optimism from?" And I love that. Give me the confidence of the man who says, I've looked at the back cover of your book and I think you're wrong. Then he went on about there's so much to be pessimistic about, and don't you know the state of the world? And which of course I do. And I said, well, it reminds me of another comment when I was having in conversation in February, and people were feeling that now our times are very much like Arendt's. They're very dark, they're very violent, it's very difficult to see a way through. And someone in that audience who was from Iraq, he basically said, a curse on your pessimism. You've got in the West, you have the luxury of being pessimistic. Where I'm coming from, we don't have the luxury of that despair. In some ways, we have to go towards the future because there is nowhere else. And I just quoted that back. And I think that's sort of why, and it's sort of where you look. I mean, this project's so good at it. That's where you put the frames for the future. And I kind of did want to say to my questioner last week, I said, well, you might have reason to be pessimistic if you're a white man in the West, it's not looking great. And it might well be that the future's somewhere else, because lots of other people seem to think it really is somewhere else. So yeah, sorry. But it's not, pessimism is not a universal luxury when you are so pushed up against the edge of existential existence, excuse me, it's late, of existence, when there is nowhere. And there's a very sweet bit, just to finish this, in the middle of Origins of Totalitarianism, where Arendt is kind of talking about her own experience of being a refugee, but it resonates for now, when she says, when you're totally rightless, totally in the shadows, when no one is seeing you, when you're completely invisible, what you often have, what people have is a kind of community of other pariahs, a community of the unseen. And she says there, what you have are the hazards of friendship and love. That's where the love of the world begins, when everything else has been stripped away.
Thank you, Lindsay. Absolutely beautiful. And I can't wait to have the time to read your book now that Rights for Time is wrapping up. I'll be like, oh, so that's what we were doing, right? I think it is poignant, the alignment between the two. And of course, we've learned so much from you throughout this project, and it's been an absolute delight. I hope everybody will join us in the future tomorrow, when we'll have Times of Trauma. And we're going to be talking about our special issue on Time, a project around youth time against trauma, children born of war research findings. We'll also have our Unbroken Voices film screening, research from Palestine, and learning from Gaza, and so much more. So please do join us for day 2 of this 4-day conference, and please tell others to join as well. It's not too late, and you could drop in on any sessions. You don't have to stay the whole time. We're just really happy to be able to share with you all of the things that have well, not come about, but have been brought into the network, and that we're hoping that will extend beyond the life of this network, which I'm sure they will. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. It's really been amazing.